Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're taking a calm, simple look at the life of Anne Boleyn. So get comfortable, relax, and let's quietly step into Tudor history together. Part 1. The world into which she was born. In the late summer of 1501, a child was born who would change the course of English history forever. But to understand her story, we must first understand the world she entered. A world of kings and kingdoms, of old faith and new ideas, of power struggles that would reshape a nation. England, at the turn of the 16th century, was still recovering from decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had torn noble families apart, brother fighting brother, until a Welsh nobleman named Henry Tudor claimed the throne at Bosworth Field in 1485. He became Henry VII, and he brought with him a fragile peace. To secure his dynasty, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. Their badge, the Tudor rose, red and white intertwined, became the symbol of a new era. The England of this time was still deeply medieval in character. The Catholic Church held dominion over not just souls, but minds, politics, and purses. Every village had its church, every town its monastery or convent. The Pope in Rome was the ultimate spiritual authority, and no king could rule effectively without the Church's blessing. The rhythm of life followed the liturgical calendar: saints' days, feast days, days of fasting and celebration. Latin was the language of learning and prayer. Pilgrims walked dusty roads to visit holy shrines. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. The world was ordered, hierarchical, and the order came from God himself, or so people believed. But winds of change were beginning to blow across Europe. In the German states, a scholar named Desiderius Erasmus was questioning church practices, advocating for reform from within. New ideas about faith, about the relationship between man and God, about the role of Scripture. These ideas traveled along trade routes and through university halls. The invention of the printing press meant that books, once rare treasures, could spread more widely. The Bible itself might one day be read by common people in their own language, not just heard in Latin from a priest's lips. Into this world of tradition and transformation, Anne Boleyn was born, probably in the year 1501, though some historians suggest it may have been as late as 1507. The uncertainty itself tells us something: she was not born important enough for precise records. She was simply another daughter of the English gentry, one of many children born to ambitious families seeking advancement. Family and origins. Anne's father was Thomas Boleyn, a man of considerable ambition and growing influence. The Boleyns were not an ancient noble family like the Howards or the Percys. They had risen through trade, through clever marriages, through service to the crown. Thomas Boleyn's great-grandfather had been a mercer, a merchant, dealing in fine fabrics, who became Lord Mayor of London. Wealth earned in commerce had purchased land, and land brought status. Thomas Boleyn was a skilled diplomat and linguist, speaking French and Latin fluently. He understood that the path to real power lay in royal service, and he cultivated connections at court with patience and care. He was described as intelligent, calculating, and willing to use whatever advantages came his way, including, eventually, his own daughters. Anne's mother was Elizabeth Howard, daughter of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk. This was the crucial marriage, for it connected the commercially successful Boleyns to one of England's most powerful noble families. The Howards were warriors and statesmen, survivors who had learned to bend with political winds. Elizabeth brought impeccable breeding to the match, while Thomas brought wealth and ability. From this union came several children. Mary Boleyn was the eldest daughter, born around 1499, or 1500. Then came Anne, and finally George, born around 1504. There may have been other children who died young, as was common in those times. The Boleyn children grew up primarily at Hever Castle in Kent, a modest but comfortable manor house surrounded by gardens and orchards, with the Kentish countryside rolling away in all directions. We know frustratingly little about Anne's childhood. No detailed letters survive, no diary entries, no first-hand accounts of her early years. What we can piece together comes from later records and from understanding how children of her station were typically raised. She would have been taught by governesses and tutors, learning first to read and write in English. A daughter of the gentry needed to manage a household one day, so she learned accounting, how to direct servants, how to ensure a great house ran smoothly. She learned needlework, creating elaborate embroideries that were both art and demonstration of skill. She learned music, the virginals, the lute perhaps, and dancing, for these were essential accomplishments at court. But Anne was also taught more than most girls of her time. Her father, with his own love of learning and languages, ensured his children received excellent educations. Anne learned French, and she learned it well enough to think in it, to dream in it, to become as fluent as any native speaker. This gift of language would shape her entire life. The Netherlands and Burgundian court. In the summer of 1513, when Anne was approximately 12 years old, her father secured her a position in one of the most prestigious households in Europe. She was to serve as a maid of honor to Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, at her court in Mechelen. This was an extraordinary opportunity. Margaret was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy. She was herself a widow twice over, and the emperor had appointed her to govern the Netherlands on his behalf. Her court at Mechelen was renowned throughout Europe as a center of learning, art, and culture. It was said that Margaret maintained a library of magnificent books, that poets and scholars gathered at her table, that music and intellectual discourse flourished under her patronage. For a young girl from the English countryside, the journey to the Netherlands must have been both terrifying and thrilling. Anne crossed the Channel, likely from Dover, and made her way to the Low Countries. The towns she passed through, Bruges, Ghent, Brussels, were wealthy beyond anything England could match, enriched by the wool trade and by banking. Their streets bustled with merchants speaking a dozen languages. Their churches held paintings of astonishing beauty and realism, a new style emerging from Flemish masters. At Mechelen, Anne entered a world of refinement and sophistication. Margaret's court followed the Burgundian tradition, which emphasized elaborate ceremony, courtly manners, and cultural achievement. The maids of honor were not merely decorative. They were educated, accomplished young women who served as companions to the regent and representations of the court's elegance. Anne would have worn the French style of dress favored at the Burgundian court gowns with flowing sleeves, hoods that draped gracefully rather than the angular gable hoods worn in England. She perfected her French, losing any English accent. She learned the intricate dances of the Burgundian court, where every step, every gesture carried meaning. She studied how to conduct herself with grace and poise, how to converse wittingly without seeming forward, how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of court life. Margaret of Austria herself took an interest in the education of her maids. She believed women should be learned, should study languages and literature, should understand theology and philosophy. In her household, Anne was exposed to the new humanist learning that was spreading from Italy through Europe. She may have encountered the works of Erasmus, who advocated for reform of the church and for making scripture accessible to all people. She certainly absorbed ideas about faith and reform that were more progressive than anything commonly heard in England. Anne remained in Margaret's service for about a year, but she made a lasting impression. When Thomas Boleyn later requested a letter of recommendation for his daughter, Margaret wrote warmly of Anne's conduct and abilities, praising her as well-behaved and accomplished. For a regent to remember a junior maid of honor so favorably speaks to something distinctive about the young Anne Boleyn. The French court. In late 1514, Anne's life took another dramatic turn. Her father had been working to arrange an even more prestigious position for her, and he succeeded beyond most men's hopes. Anne was to join the household of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, who was traveling to France to marry King Louis XII. The marriage was a diplomatic alliance, though not a romantic one. Mary Tudor was 18, beautiful and vivacious. Louis XII was 52, gouty and in declining health. But such was the nature of royal marriages. They were treaties sealed with vows and consummated in hope of heirs. Anne crossed the Channel once more, this time as part of a magnificent entourage. The English court spared no expense in sending their princess to France. Ships carried not just Mary and her ladies, but also wedding gifts, furnishings, wardrobes containing dozens of gowns, jewels, and everything necessary to establish an English-born Queen of France in proper state. Anne was one of the maids of honor attending Mary Tudor, though she was far from the most important. She was still just a girl of 13 or 14, one attendant among many. But she was about to enter the most brilliant court in Europe. When they arrived in France in October 1514, Anne found herself in a world of splendor that eclipsed even Margaret's Burgundian court. The French Renaissance was in full flower. King Louis, despite his age and infirmity, maintained a court of legendary magnificence at his various chateaux along the Loire Valley and in Paris. But Anne's service to Mary Tudor as Queen of France was brief. Louis XII, worn out perhaps by his young bride's energy, died on New Year's Day, 1515, less than 3 months after the wedding. Mary Tudor's time as Queen of France ended almost before it began. However, this did not mean Anne's return to England. When Mary Tudor left France secretly marrying Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, the man she had loved all along, Anne remained behind. She transferred to the household of the new French queen, Claude, wife of the new king, Francis I. This was where Anne truly came of age. She would spend the next 7 years in France, from approximately 1515 to 1522, through her teenage years and into young womanhood. These were formative years, and they shaped everything she would become. The world of Francis I. Francis I was everything a Renaissance king should be. Tall, athletic, cultured. He was 20 years old when he came to the throne. He loved hunting, tournaments, music, poetry, and women, not necessarily in that order. His court was both chivalrous and sensual, a place where courtly love was practiced as an art form and where flirtation was constant entertainment. Queen Claude was Francis's opposite, in many ways small, somewhat plain, deeply pious. She limped from a deformity and lacked her husband's charisma. But she was kind, dutiful, and fertile. She would bear Francis 7 children before her death at 24. She maintained her own household of ladies in waiting, and it was here that Anne served. The French court moved constantly, traveling from chateau to chateau as the king hunted and held court. Anne would have known Amboise, Blois, Chambord, magnificent palaces that were as much works of art as residences. Chambord especially, which Francis began building in 1519, was a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, its double helix staircase and hundreds of rooms declaring France's wealth and power. At the French court, Anne completed her transformation from English girl to sophisticated courtier. She became entirely French in manner and taste. Her clothing followed French fashion, lower necklines, wider sleeves, the French hood that sat back on the head, revealing the hair rather than covering it completely as English hoods did. She became an accomplished dancer, mastering the slow, stately pavane and the livelier galliard. She played the lute and sang, for music was constant at Francis's court. But Anne developed more than social graces. She became witty, sharp-tongued, able to hold her own in the verbal sparring that was court entertainment. French court culture valued intelligence in women, valued a woman who could debate and discourse, who could write elegant letters and compose clever verses. Anne absorbed all this, developing a personality that was bold, confident, and unafraid to speak her mind. She also developed strong religious convictions during these years. The French court was a hotbed of reform ideas. Queen Claude's own mother, Anne of Brittany, had been influenced by reform-minded clerics. In France, even before Martin Luther's famous protest in Germany in 1517, there were those who questioned church practices, who wanted scripture available in French who thought the church needed purification and renewal. Anne encountered these ideas and embraced them. She read the Bible in French, which was itself a mildly controversial act. She read other reformist literature, absorbing arguments about the nature of faith and the proper relationship between church and state. These were not yet Protestant ideas. Protestantism as such barely existed, but they were reform ideas, and they took deep root in Anne's mind and heart. She also witnessed the complex politics of kings and popes. In 1520, Francis I and Henry VIII of England met at the Field of Cloth of Gold, a spectacular diplomatic summit held between Calais and Gwens. The two kings competed in displays of wealth and power so extravagant that the very name of the meeting reflected its excess. Anne was there, presumably, as part of Queen Claude's household. She would have seen the temporary palace built for the occasion, the tournaments, the feasts, the careful theater of diplomacy. Through all these years, Anne maintained some connection to England. Her father visited France on diplomatic missions. Her sister Mary returned to England and married William Carey, a gentleman of Henry VIII's household. But Anne herself remained in France, becoming more French than English in all but blood. Return to England. In late 1521, or early 1522, Thomas Boleyn recalled his daughter to England. The reasons were partly diplomatic relations between England and France were deteriorating as Henry VIII aligned with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V against Francis I. It was no longer advantageous, or even safe, to have an English girl at the French court. But there were also personal reasons. Anne was now 20 or 21 years old, fully accomplished, ready for marriage. Her father had plans for her advancement. Anne's return to England must have been jarring. She had left as a child of 12. She returned as a sophisticated French woman of 21. England seemed provincial by comparison, its court less elegant, its people less refined. The English nobility still dressed in the angular, stiff styles that France had abandoned years before. They danced old-fashioned dances. They were, by French standards, somewhat behind the times. But Anne adapted, as she always would. She brought French style to England, wearing her French hoods and French gowns, teaching English ladies the new dances, playing music in the French style. She created a sensation simply by being different, by bringing continental sophistication to Henry VIII's court. Her father's plan was to marry her well. He had secured a tentative betrothal to James Butler, son of the Earl of Ormond, a match that would resolve a long-standing dispute over the Ormond inheritance. But this betrothal dragged on without conclusion. James Butler was in Ireland, and the negotiations proved complex. While these marriage discussions continued, Anne took up a position at court, probably as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Here she entered the world of King Henry VIII, though she could not have known that this entrance would determine the course of her life. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. To understand what happened next, we must understand Henry VIII as he was in the early 1522, and we must understand his marriage. Henry had become king in 1509, just short of his 18th birthday. He was tall, athletic, handsome, accomplished in all knightly arts. He jousted, hunted, composed music, wrote poetry, and debated theology with learned men. He was pious, hearing multiple masses daily, going on pilgrimage, defending the Catholic faith against Martin Luther's heresies. The Pope had granted him the title Defender of the Faith in recognition of a book Henry had written against Luther. Henry had married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, shortly after becoming king. Catherine was his brother, Arthur's widow. Arthur had died in 1502, leaving Catherine in a difficult position. After years of uncertainty, Henry had married her, partly out of chivalry, partly to secure the Spanish alliance. Catherine was 5 years older than Henry, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, cultured and educated, deeply religious and dignified. For the first years of their marriage, they had been happy. Henry was attentive. Catherine was devoted. But tragedy stalked them. Catherine became pregnant in 1510, but delivered a stillborn daughter. She became pregnant again in 1511, and bore a son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall. But the baby died after just 52 days. More pregnancies followed, and more losses. In 1516, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Mary, who lived. This was some comfort, but England needed a male heir. By the early 1522, Catherine was in her late 30s, and it was becoming clear she would bear no more children. Henry had only one legitimate child, a daughter, and daughters had never successfully ruled England. The question of the succession haunted Henry. What would happen to the Tudor dynasty? Would England descend back into civil war after his death? Moreover, Henry's eye was wandering. He had taken mistresses before he had at least one acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, born to Elizabeth Blount in 1519. But these affairs had been discreet, and Catherine had maintained her dignity as queen. Into this situation came Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary, the Boleyn sisters at court. Mary Boleyn had returned from France before Anne, marrying William Carey in 1520. Mary was pretty, pleasant, and accommodating, and at some point in the early 1522s, she became the king's mistress. The affair was discreet enough that no contemporary records openly acknowledge it, but it was known at court and would be referenced later. Mary's affair with Henry apparently ended around 1525 or 1526, without drama or consequences. She had gained no particular advancement from it, though her husband received some minor appointments that might have been royal favors. When Anne appeared at court, probably in late 1522 or early 1523, she was very different from her sister. Where Mary was soft and yielding, Anne was sharp and spirited. Where Mary had blonde hair and conventional prettiness, Anne had dark hair and striking features that were not beautiful in the conventional sense, but were arresting dark eyes, a long neck, an olive complexion that was fashionable in France, but unusual in England. Anne attracted attention immediately. Her French sophistication, her wit, her confidence, all set her apart. Young men at court began paying her attention, writing her poems, seeking her company. One of these men was Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, one of England's greatest noble families. Percy was young, romantic, and susceptible to Anne's charms. A courtship developed between them, intense enough that they may have entered into a formal betrothal, a pre-contract of marriage. But Thomas Boleyn and the Earl of Northumberland had made no such arrangement. When word of the attachment reached them, both fathers acted swiftly to end it. Percy was already betrothed to Mary Talbot, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister, summoned Percy and berated him for presuming to contract himself without his father's consent. The relationship ended. Anne was reportedly devastated and angry. She was sent away from court for a time, perhaps to Hever Castle, perhaps to cool down and let the scandal pass. Later accounts, not entirely reliable, claim she blamed Cardinal Wolsey for the broken romance and vowed revenge against him. Whether she truly made such a vow, we cannot know. But certainly, the affair with Percy marked Anne. It showed her that her heart's desires could be overruled by men's political calculations. When Anne returned to court in 1526 or early 1527, everything was about to change. The king's great matter begins. King Henry VIII, by early 1527, had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was cursed by God. The key scriptural passage was Leviticus 20:21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Henry reasoned that this explained why Catherine had borne no sons who survived their marriage, violated divine law, because Catherine had been married to his brother Arthur first. Never mind that Henry and Catherine had been granted a papal dispensation to marry specifically because of Catherine's previous marriage to Arthur. Never mind that they had a daughter. So, we're not technically childless. Henry convinced himself that his lack of male heirs was divine punishment and that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in God's eyes. At what point Henry fell in love with Anne Boleyn remains uncertain. Some historians place it as early as 1525 or 1526. What is clear is that by 1527, Henry was pursuing Anne with increasing determination, but Anne was not her sister. She would not become the king's mistress. When Henry made his intentions clear, Anne responded in a way that astonished the court. She refused him. 17 letters survive from Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn, written in Henry's own hand between about 1527 and 1529. These letters reveal a king frustrated, besotted, pleading. In one, he wrote, "If it pleases you to do the office of a true, loyal mistress and friend, and to give yourself body and soul to me, I promise you that not only the name will be given you, but also that I will take you for my only mistress, rejecting from thought and affection all others save yourself." Anne's responses to these letters have not survived, but we can infer their nature from Henry's subsequent letters. She was holding him at arm's length, neither accepting nor entirely rejecting his advances. She was playing the most dangerous game imaginable, keeping a king interested without surrendering to him. What was Anne thinking? Some historians portray her as a calculating schemer from the start, determined to be queen. Others see her as genuinely reluctant, genuinely trying to protect her honor, only gradually realizing that Henry might actually marry her if she held out long enough. The truth likely combines both elements. Anne was intelligent enough to see that becoming Henry's mistress would gain her nothing. Her sister's experience proved that. But becoming Henry's wife, his queen, that was a different matter entirely. That would secure her family's advancement forever, would give her power, position, everything she might dream of. And so she waited. She kept Henry, hoping, desiring, pursuing, and Henry, for his part, became increasingly obsessed. He convinced himself that if he could only marry Anne, she would give him sons. She was young, healthy, vivacious. Surely God would bless a true marriage with heirs. The annulment campaign. By mid-1527, Henry had set in motion the legal process to annul his marriage to Catherine. He informed Catherine that their marriage had been invalid, that they had been living in sin for 18 years. Catherine, devastated but defiant, refused to accept this. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She had come to Henry's bed a virgin, and therefore the Levitical prohibition did not apply. Their marriage was valid, and she was his true wife and queen. The matter fell to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey to resolve. Wolsey was the most powerful man in England, after the King, Lord Chancellor, Archbishop of York, Papal Legate. He had governed England efficiently for 15 years, while Henry hunted and jousted. Wolsey was brilliant, proud, and pragmatic. He understood immediately that Henry's request was monumentally complicated. Wolsey needed the Pope to declare Henry's marriage invalid. But Pope Clement VII was in an impossible position. In 1527, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, had sacked Rome, effectively holding the Pope prisoner. Clement could not afford to offend Charles by invalidating his aunt's marriage, but neither could he afford to completely refuse the King of England, so the Pope temporized. He sent Cardinal Campeggio to England to hear the case alongside Wolsey. Campeggio was under secret orders to delay as long as possible, to find any compromise that would avoid a final decision. The case opened at Blackfriars in London in June 1529. Catherine appeared in person, made a dramatic appeal to Henry, and then walked out, refusing to acknowledge the court's jurisdiction. She appealed directly to Rome over Wolsey's head, demanding the Pope hear her case personally. While lawyers argued, Anne waited. She had moved into apartments at court, apartments that connected to the king's through private passages. She was being treated as a queen in waiting. Foreign ambassadors were beginning to pay her court, recognizing which way the wind blew. But still, she was not queen, and there was no certainty she would be. The Blackfriars court dragged through the summer of 1529, without reaching a verdict. Finally, in July, Campeggio announced that the case would be adjourned and referred back to Rome. It was a devastating blow to Henry and to Wolsey. The cardinal had failed to deliver what his king wanted most. In October 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his offices and possessions. He was charged with praemunire, exercising papal jurisdiction in England, which was technically illegal under old statutes. The man who had governed England for 15 years fell spectacularly. He died a year later on his way to London to face treason charges, reportedly saying, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." Anne Boleyn's influence in Wolsey's fall is debated. She certainly hated him, blaming him for breaking up her romance with Henry Percy years before. Whether she actively worked to destroy him or merely encouraged Henry's anger remains uncertain. But with Wolsey gone, Anne's path to the throne had one fewer obstacle: the rise of reform. With Wolsey's fall, new men rose to prominence around the king. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, a lawyer and administrator of genius who had served Wolsey and now transferred his services to the king. Cromwell understood what Wolsey had, not that the answer to Henry's problem lay not in negotiating with Rome, but in breaking from Rome entirely. Cromwell and others were influenced by reform ideas spreading from the continent. Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation had begun in Germany in 1517 and was spreading rapidly. Luther argued that the Bible alone was the authority for Christian faith, not the Pope or church tradition. He argued that salvation came through faith alone, not through sacraments or good works administered by priests. His ideas were revolutionary, threatening to overturn the entire medieval religious order. England had mostly resisted Protestant ideas so far. Henry had written against Luther. The church in England burned heretical books and occasionally heretics themselves. But reform ideas were circulating among educated people, among merchants who traded with the continent, among students who studied in continental universities. Anne Boleyn was sympathetic to these reform ideas. As we have seen, she owned reformist books, some of them banned in England. She discussed theology with reform-minded chaplains. She protected several reform preachers from persecution. She believed the church needed purification, that the Pope had usurped authority that belonged to kings, that Scripture should be available in English so people could read it themselves. How much Anne's religious views influenced Henry is debated. Henry was not a Protestant in any theological sense. He continued to believe in transubstantiation, in the real presence of Christ, in the Eucharist, in the necessity of priestly confession, in most Catholic doctrines. But he was willing to embrace the idea that the Pope had no authority in England, that kings answered to God alone, not to any earthly churchman. Cromwell developed a plan. If Parliament declared the Pope had no authority in England, if the king was declared supreme head of the church in England, then Henry could annul his own marriage without needing papal permission. It was breathtakingly radical. It meant breaking with Rome, with 1,000 years of Christian unity. But it would work. Beginning in 1529, the Reformation Parliament began passing acts that limited papal authority and increased royal power over the church. Clergy were required to acknowledge the king as supreme head of the church in England as far as the law of Christ allows. Church courts' powers were restricted, annates payments to Rome were limited. The legal groundwork was being laid for a revolution. Part 12. Secret Marriage. By late 1532, Henry's patience was exhausted. He had waited more than 5 years for his annulment. Catherine was still queen, still living in royal state, though banished from court. The Pope was still refusing to grant Henry's request, and Henry wanted Anne Boleyn with an obsession that had not diminished. Anne herself was under enormous pressure. She was 31 years old, ancient by the standards of the time for an unmarried woman. She had committed herself to Henry, but there was still no certainty she would become queen. If Henry grew tired of waiting, if he found someone else, if the political situation changed, she could end up with nothing, her reputation ruined, her years of waiting wasted. In September 1532, Henry took Anne to Calais to meet with King Francis I of France. It was a semi-official acknowledgement of Anne's status. She was treated almost as queen, though Catherine was still alive and still legally married to Henry. Francis, Henry's ally against the emperor, was willing to show Anne honor to maintain the English alliance. Sometime in late 1532, or January 1533, Anne finally surrendered to Henry. The exact timing is uncertain, but by January 1533, Anne knew she was pregnant. This changed everything. If the child was a boy, and if it was born illegitimate, it could not inherit the throne. Henry had to marry Anne immediately, before the pregnancy showed, and he had to do it in a way that could be presented as legal. On the 25th of January 1533, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were married in secret. The ceremony took place in a chamber in Whitehall Palace, conducted by one of Henry's chaplains. It was a small, quiet affair, no celebration, no public announcement. Henry was still legally married to Catherine, but Henry and Cromwell were moving to change that. In March 1533, Parliament passed the Act of Appeals, which declared that England was an empire, that the king was subject to no foreign authority, and that all legal cases, including marriage cases, must be decided within England, not appealed to Rome. With this act in place, Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, could legally decide Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid. Cranmer was a reform-minded cleric who believed the Pope had no authority over English kings. He opened a court at Dunstable in May 1533, summoned Catherine, who refused to appear, heard the evidence, and declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. 5 days later, on the 28th of May 1533, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Anne was valid. Anne Boleyn was now legally Queen of England. Coronation. On the 1st of June 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. The coronation was magnificent, a display of royal power and ceremony designed to impress upon everyone that Anne was now England's anointed queen. The celebrations began days earlier. Anne traveled from Greenwich to the Tower of London by royal barge, accompanied by a flotilla of vessels. Pageants greeted her arrival, with actors representing classical and biblical heroines, comparing Anne to Esther and to other queens of history. The next day, Anne processed through London in a litter covered with white cloth of gold, dressed in white robes, her dark hair flowing loose down her back, wearing a crown. Pageants were staged at various points along the route, fountains ran with wine, children sang, actors performed allegories celebrating Anne as the queen who would bring England prosperity and a male heir. The coronation itself followed ancient ritual. Anne wore purple velvet trimmed with ermine. She processed into Westminster Abbey to the sound of choirs singing. She was anointed with holy oil, crowned and enthroned. She received the homage of nobles and bishops. She was queen by every law and ceremony known to England. But not everyone celebrated. Many people, perhaps most people, still considered Catherine the true queen. Catherine was popular. She was dignified, pious, Spanish, but long settled in England, sympathetic in her suffering. Anne was the interloper, the woman who had broken up the king's marriage. People called her the concubine, or worse. Some called her Nan Boleyn, using a common form of her name as an insult, implying she was base-born. At Anne's coronation, observers noted that the crowds were large but quiet. There was no wild enthusiasm, no outpouring of love for the new queen. People watched, curious or sullen, but they did not cheer the way they had once cheered Catherine. Still, Anne was queen. And in September 1533, she went into confinement to await the birth of the child who would, everyone assumed, be the prince England needed. The birth of Elizabeth. On the 7th of September, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, after a relatively easy labor, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Elizabeth, after both Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York, and Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard. She was healthy and perfect, but she was not a son. Henry's disappointment must have been crushing. though he hid it publicly. Astrologers and physicians had confidently predicted a boy. Letters announcing the birth had been prepared with prince written, and someone had to hastily add an SS to make princess. Jousts planned to celebrate the birth of a prince were quietly cancelled. Still, Henry and Anne tried to make the best of it. Elizabeth was a princess, healthy and legitimate. Anne was young, only 32, and had proven she could bear children. Next time, surely, it would be a son. But Elizabeth's arrival as a daughter, not a son, had consequences. It meant that everything Henry had done, breaking with Rome, divorcing Catherine, enduring years of political and diplomatic isolation, had so far produced only what he already had, a legitimate daughter. Catherine's daughter Mary was 17, intelligent, and devoted to her mother. Elizabeth was an infant. In practical terms, Henry's situation regarding the succession had not improved. Anne was churched the ceremony of Thanksgiving after childbirth, and she resumed her place as queen. She presided over court, distributed patronage, involved herself in religious reform. She worked to establish her own household, to create a faction of supporters, to become more than just Henry's wife, but a political force in her own right. She also worked to suppress any recognition of Catherine or Mary. Catherine was now officially the Princess Dowager, not Queen, demoted to her status as Arthur's widow. Mary was illegitimate, no longer a princess. Anne insisted on this. She could not be secure as queen while Catherine lived and was called queen, while Mary was considered legitimate and was in line for the throne ahead of Elizabeth. Catherine, exiled to increasingly remote manor houses, refused to accept her demotion. She continued to sign herself Catherine the Queen until her death. Mary, 17 years old and devoted to her mother, also refused to acknowledge Anne as queen or Elizabeth as legitimate. This created a bitter, irreconcilable division at the heart of English politics. The Reformation advances. With Anne as queen and Cromwell as the king's chief minister, the religious transformation of England accelerated. The break with Rome was not just about Henry's marriage, it became a full reformation of the English Church. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which formally declared Henry VIII to be the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This was no longer qualified by, as far as the law of Christ allows. It was absolute. The king, not the pope, was now head of the Church in England. Anyone who refused to acknowledge this supremacy was guilty of treason. The most prominent refusals came from men of conscience and learning. Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, a brilliant humanist scholar and author, refused to swear the oath, accepting the Act of Supremacy. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, a respected theologian and Catherine of Aragon's staunchest defender, also refused. Both were imprisoned in the Tower of London. Anne's role in these events is complex and debated. Some sources suggest she tried to save More, that she sent messages to him urging him to submit. Others suggest she encouraged Henry's harshness toward those who refused the oath. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Anne was committed to the religious reforms, believing them right and necessary, but she may not have wanted bloodshed to achieve them. In June and July 1535, both Fisher and More were executed. Fisher went to the block as a frail old man of 76. More, beloved by many as England's greatest scholar, died with a joke on his lips, asking the executioner to spare his beard, for that has committed no treason. Europe was horrified. The Pope made Fisher a cardinal while he awaited execution, a futile gesture that only ensured his death. The executions of such eminent men sent a clear message. Opposition to Henry's religious policies would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, Cromwell's agents were conducting a survey of England's monasteries and religious houses. The Valor Ecclesiasticus, as it was called, documented the wealth of these institutions in extraordinary detail. There were over 800 monasteries, priories, friaries, and nunneries in England, holding perhaps a third of the nation's landed wealth. Cromwell's survey revealed corruption and laxity in some houses, but it also revealed enormous assets. Anne supported the dissolution of the monasteries, but for different reasons than Cromwell or Henry. She believed many monasteries had become corrupt, that they hoarded wealth that should be used for godly purposes. She wanted the confiscated monastic wealth to fund education, to support the poor, to establish schools and universities, to pay preachers who would teach Reformed doctrine. But Anne's vision was not Henry's vision. Henry saw the monastic wealth as a solution to his chronic financial problems, as lands and treasure that could be seized for the crown, sold to raise revenue, granted to supporters to purchase loyalty. Over the next several years, the dissolution of the monasteries would transfer unprecedented wealth to the crown and ultimately to a new class of landowners who purchased monastic property. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in English history since the Norman Conquest, and it would permanently alter English society. Anne also patronized reformers and reform literature. She protected preachers like Hugh Latimer, who advocated for scripture in English. She supported William Tyndale's translation of the Bible, even though Tyndale himself was a wanted heretic living in exile. When Matthew's Bible, essentially Tyndale's translation under a different name, was published in 1537, it bore the words, "Set forth with the king's most gracious license, a triumph of the reform cause." But Anne's prominence in religious matters made her enemies. Many nobles remained Catholic at heart, uncomfortable with the break from Rome, hostile to the religious changes sweeping England. The Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, had no love for religious reform. The common people, deeply attached to the old ways, to their saints and shrines and rituals, resented changes forced upon them. When Anne pushed for reform, she made herself a target. The pressure of the succession. Despite the religious and political upheavals, the central fact remained: Anne needed to produce a son. This was her primary duty as queen, the justification for everything that had been done. Henry had broken with Rome, defied the Pope, divided his kingdom, all to marry Anne and have legitimate male heirs. In the summer of 1534, Anne became pregnant again. This time, surely, it would be a son. But in late 1534, or early 1535, Anne miscarried. The details are murky. Contemporary sources are vague about Anne's pregnancies and losses, as such matters were considered private, but it appears she lost a child. Then, in late 1535, Anne conceived again. By January 1536, she was visibly pregnant. The baby would be due in summer. Henry allowed himself to hope once more, but on the 7th of January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbleton Castle. She was 50 years old, worn down by years of exile, humiliation, and separation from her daughter. She died insisting she was Henry's true wife and England's true queen. Her last letter to Henry called herself Catherine the Queen and affirmed her love for him. Henry's reaction was complex. Publicly, he celebrated, wearing yellow, whether as mourning or celebration is debated, and showing off the infant Elizabeth. With Catherine dead, there could be no question about the validity of his marriage to Anne. Mary, Catherine's daughter, was now fully illegitimate. Her mother's death removed any lingering question about the succession. But Anne's reaction to Catherine's death revealed her own insecurity. She too reportedly wore yellow, but sources suggest she understood that Catherine's death removed a certain protection. While Catherine lived, Henry could not easily set Anne aside. To do so would be to admit his first divorce was wrong. But with Catherine dead, if Henry tired of Anne, he could claim his second marriage was also somehow invalid, and there would be no rightful prior wife to vindicate. Anne's fears proved prescient. On the 24th of January 1536, just 17 days after Catherine's death, Henry had a terrible accident while jousting. His horse fell on him, and he lay unconscious for 2 hours. When he woke, he was in terrible pain and seems to have been deeply shaken. The king, who had been such a vigorous athlete, was suddenly 44 years old, injured, aware of his mortality. 5 days later, on the 29th of January 1536, Anne miscarried a son. The child was far enough along, perhaps 3.5 to 4 months, that its sex was identifiable. It was the male heir Henry so desperately wanted, but born dead. Anne later claimed the miscarriage was caused by shock at Henry's jousting accident, or by distress when she found Henry with Jane Seymour, one of her own ladies-in-waiting. But Henry saw it differently. He is reported to have said to one of his close advisers that he now believed his marriage to Anne had been cursed by God, just as his marriage to Catherine had been. He had been seduced by witchcraft into marrying Anne, he claimed, and God would never grant him sons with her. It was a death sentence, though Anne did not yet know it. The final months. The spring of 1536 was a time of hidden danger. Anne still carried herself as queen, still presided over court, still worked to advance the reform cause. But behind closed doors, Thomas Cromwell was turning against her. The reasons for Cromwell's betrayal of Anne are debated. Some historians argue it was purely political. Cromwell wanted an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, and that alliance required setting Anne aside. As long as Anne was queen, Charles V would never ally with England, because Anne's position depended on Catherine's repudiation, and Catherine was Charles's aunt. Others argue Cromwell and Anne had policy disagreements, particularly over what to do with monastic wealth. Still others suggest Cromwell simply recognized that Henry wanted to be rid of Anne and positioned himself to make it happen. Whatever Cromwell's motives, he began building a case against Anne in April 1536. It would not be a simple divorce. Henry had learned from the Catherine of Aragon debacle that annulments were difficult, time-consuming, and opened him to criticism. Instead, Cromwell would destroy Anne utterly, making it impossible for anyone to defend her. The method was accusations of adultery. If Anne had committed adultery, she had betrayed the king. If she had committed adultery with multiple men, it suggested conspiracy, and if one of those men was her own brother, it suggested depravity so extreme that her execution would be seen as justified. Cromwell began with Mark Smeaton, a court musician, a commoner, a young man known for his musical talent and his presence in the Queen's chambers. On the 30th of April 1536, Smeaton was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house. What happened there is not entirely clear, but Smeaton was probably tortured. He was the only one of the accused who confessed to adultery with the Queen. Whether through fear, through actual torture, or through promises that his life would be spared if he confessed, Smeaton gave Cromwell what he needed. On the 1st of May, 1536, May Day, there was a tournament at Greenwich. Anne was present, watching from the royal stand. Henry was there as well. At some point during the tournament, Henry abruptly rose and left, taking only a few attendants with him. He rode to Westminster, leaving Anne behind, confused and alarmed. The next day, May 2, Anne was arrested at Greenwich and taken by barge to the Tower of London. She entered through the Watergate, the same gate through which she had entered in triumph before her coronation just 3 years before. She was now a prisoner, accused of adultery with 5 men, accused of plotting the king's death, accused of incest with her own brother. The 5 men accused alongside Anne were Mark Smeaton, the musician, Sir Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and close personal attendant, Sir Francis Weston, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, William Brereton, another gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's brother. These were not random choices. Norris, Weston, and Brereton were all members of Henry's inner circle, men who attended him daily, who were part of the Privy Chamber where power and patronage flowed. By accusing them, Cromwell was destroying a faction at court, removing Anne's supporters, and clearing the way for new men to rise. George Boleyn's inclusion was particularly vicious. The charge of incest between Anne and her brother was designed to make Anne seem not just unfaithful, but monstrous. The accusation was that they had committed incest at Westminster in November 1535, when Anne was pregnant with a child she would miscarry in January. The evidence against all of them was flimsy. It consisted primarily of Smeaton's confession, obtained under duress. The other evidence was based on the normal interactions of a queen and her courtiers, conversations, games of cards, gifts, the kind of courtly flirtation that was standard at Renaissance courts. Norris had jousted wearing Anne's favor. Weston had said in jest that he loved Anne more than his own wife. George Boleyn had spent time alone with his sister, as her brother naturally would. But in the charged atmosphere of spring 1536, with Cromwell presenting the evidence and the king's will clear, this was enough. The men were arrested on various dates between May 1 and May 4. They were all taken to the Tower. All except Smeaton maintained their innocence. They had been loyal servants of the king, they insisted. They had never betrayed him. Anne herself protested her innocence with vehemence. In the Tower, she spoke to Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, and he recorded her words, rambling, anxious, sometimes hysterical words. She spoke of her interactions with the accused men, trying to understand what she had done wrong. She had been friendly with them, had joked with them, had accepted their courtly attentions in the way queens did. How had that become treason? She also said something revealing. She asked if Norris had accused her. When told that Norris continued to maintain his innocence, she said, "I am very glad of that." It suggests she understood that the case against her depended on confessions, and that if the men maintained their innocence, the charges might fall apart. But Smeaton's confession was enough. With one confession obtained, Cromwell had what he needed to proceed. The trials. The four commoners, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, and Brereton, were tried together on the 12th of May, 1536, at Westminster Hall. The trial was swift, the verdict foreordained. Smeaton's confession was read. Evidence of the other men's interactions with the Queen was presented. The jury found all four guilty of high treason. The sentence was the horrific punishment reserved for commoners guilty of treason against the king to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. George Boleyn and Anne Boleyn, as nobles, were entitled to trial by their peers, by other nobles sitting in judgment. George's trial took place on May 15 at the Tower of London. The evidence against him was the same as against the others' normal sibling interaction, twisted into something sinister. But there was one additional piece of evidence that created a sensation. A letter was produced, allegedly from Anne to George, hinting at impropriety. Then a second accusation was made, so explosive that it was written down rather than spoken aloud in court. The paper was handed to George to read. He immediately read it aloud, violating protocol. The accusation was that Anne had told his wife that Henry was impotent, that the king could not perform sexually. Whether this accusation was true or false, George's decision to read it aloud was politically disastrous. If true, it impugned the king's manhood. If false, it suggested the Boleyns were willing to spread vicious lies about the king. Either way, it sealed George's fate. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Anne's trial took place later the same day, May 15. She was brought into the great hall of the Tower, where 1,000 spectators had gathered. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided as Lord High Steward. 26 peers sat in judgment, including her uncle, her former suitor Henry Percy, and others who had reason to dislike her or to curry favor with the king by finding her guilty. The charges were read: adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, plotting the king's death. Anne denied everything. She spoke with dignity and composure, addressing each charge, defending her honor. Observers noted her calmness, her eloquence. Some were moved by her defense. But the verdict was never in doubt. Every peer voted guilty. The sentence was pronounced by Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, his voice reportedly breaking as he spoke the words, "Anne was to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure." She had been queen for just over 3 years. Now, she was a condemned traitor, waiting to die. The final days. Anne was returned to her apartments in the Tower after her trial. She had 5 days to live. though the exact date of execution was not immediately announced, perhaps to keep her in suspense, perhaps because arrangements needed to be made. During those final days, Anne seems to have achieved a certain peace. She knew she would die, and she prepared herself spiritually. She asked to receive the sacrament, and she swore on the consecrated host, the body of Christ, in Catholic belief that she was innocent of the charges against her. In an age of deep religious belief, this oath carried tremendous weight. To swear falsely on the Eucharist would damn one's immortal soul. She also made arrangements for her burial and asked to see her chaplain. She spoke of her daughter Elizabeth, though whether she was allowed any contact with the child is unknown. Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, too young to understand that her mother was about to die. On May 17, Anne was informed that she would not die that day. There was a delay. The reason remains unclear. Perhaps the executioner Henry had summoned from Calais had not yet arrived. Henry had sent for an expert swordsman, an executioner who used a sword rather than the common axe. It was, in its way, a mercy the sword was quicker, cleaner, less likely to require multiple blows. But the delay meant Anne had to endure 2 more days of waiting. On the same day, the 5 men accused with her were executed. They died not by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Henry had commuted their sentences to simple beheading, another small mercy. They went to the scaffold on Tower Hill, each making a brief speech. All maintained their innocence, though court protocol of the time required condemned traitors to acknowledge the justice of their sentence, so their speeches were carefully worded. Smeaton alone reportedly said he deserved death, which some took as confirmation of guilt, though he may simply have been more thoroughly broken by his interrogation. George Boleyn's speech was particularly moving. He warned the crowd against excess in all things, including lusts of the flesh, then said cryptically that if he were to explain why he stood there, he would only slander the innocent and perpetuate false accusations. It was as close as he dared come to proclaiming Anne's innocence. Their bodies were buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds, without ceremony. Anne learned of their deaths. She now knew she was truly alone. The morning of May 19, Anne woke early on the 19th of May, 1536. She heard Mass with her chaplain and received communion one final time. She is reported to have said to those attending her, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." Then she laughed and put her hands around her throat, a gesture that disturbed those present, but may have been her way of maintaining courage through dark humor. She dressed carefully in a gown of dark gray damask with a low neckline over a crimson kirtle. Her hair was pinned up beneath a simple white coif, leaving her neck bare for the sword. She had requested that her ladies be allowed to accompany her, and this was granted. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, she was led from her apartments to Tower Green, a private space within the Tower walls. Normally, executions took place publicly on Tower Hill, where crowds could gather, but Anne's execution would be more private, witnessed only by a select group of officials, nobles, foreign ambassadors, and members of the court. A scaffold had been erected, draped in black cloth, with straw scattered on it to absorb the blood. The executioner waited, dressed in black, his sword concealed in the straw. Anne climbed the steps to the scaffold, accompanied by her ladies. One of them would later describe how composed Anne appeared, how she showed no fear, how she seemed almost eager to have it done. At the scaffold, Anne addressed the crowd. Custom required a final speech, and every word was noted, for people would later try to understand whether she was guilty or innocent from what she said. "Good Christian people," Anne began, her voice clear and steady, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best, And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul. It was a careful speech, revealing nothing, accusing no one, praising Henry perhaps out of genuine feeling, perhaps out of hope that he would show mercy to her family, particularly her daughter Elizabeth. The phrase, "judge the best," has been interpreted many ways, as a subtle declaration of innocence, as a plea for people to think well of her, as an acknowledgement that she could not speak freely. After her speech, Anne knelt. Her ladies removed the coif from her head and bound her eyes with a cloth. She continued to pray aloud, repeating, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul." Over and over, the words steadying her for what was to come. The executioner moved quietly behind her. He had an assistant who distracted Anne at the crucial moment by calling out, drawing her attention. The executioner raised his sword, an expert blade brought from Calais for this purpose. With one clean stroke, he severed Anne Boleyn's head from her body. It was over in an instant. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was dead. She was approximately 35 years old, though her exact age remained uncertain even in death. The immediate aftermath. Anne's body and severed head were wrapped in cloth by her ladies, who wept over the remains. No proper coffin had been provided as sign of how complete her disgrace was meant to be. An arrow chest was found, and Anne's remains were placed inside. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, in an unmarked grave near the high altar, close to where her brother George had been buried 2 days before. The burial was hasty, without ceremony, without prayers. For the moment, the woman who had been crowned Queen of England just 3 years before was simply gone, removed from the world as thoroughly as those in power could manage. Within hours of Anne's death, Henry VIII became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. The very next day, May 20, they were married in a quiet ceremony at the Palace of Whitehall. Henry wore white for the wedding, the color of mourning in royal tradition. Though whether he mourned Anne or was simply observing, protocol is unknowable. The speed was shocking but politically necessary. Henry needed to establish beyond doubt that his marriage to Jane was legitimate, that any children they might have would be unquestionably heirs to the throne. Within 11 days of Anne's execution, Parliament passed an act declaring Elizabeth illegitimate, just as Mary had been declared illegitimate before her. Both of Henry's daughters were now legally bastards. The succession was now vested in any children Henry might have with Jane, or failing that, in whomever Henry might name. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, the same man who had declared Henry's marriage to Anne valid just 3 years before, now declared it had been invalid from the start. The grounds were vague, never fully explained. Some historians suggest it was based on Henry's prior relationship with Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister. If that relationship had been sexual, then under church law, Henry had contracted affinity with the Boleyn family and could not validly marry Anne. But this theory was never stated openly, perhaps because it was too legally weak, perhaps because it would have cast doubt on Elizabeth's status. The legal acrobatics required to invalidate the marriage while still maintaining Anne had been guilty of adultery were extraordinary. If the marriage was invalid, Anne had never truly been queen, so her relationships with other men could not technically have been adultery against the king. But this logical problem was simply ignored. Anne's guilt was asserted, her marriage was annulled, and Henry moved forward with Jane Seymour. The Boleyn family was shattered. Thomas Boleyn, Anne and George's father, was stripped of some offices but allowed to keep others. He survived, living quietly, until his death in 1539, a broken man who had seen both his children executed. Anne's mother, Elizabeth, disappears from historical record around this time. She likely died soon after, perhaps of grief, or perhaps simply because she was no longer significant enough to record. Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, had married a common soldier named William Stafford after her first husband's death. She survived, living in obscurity, occasionally receiving small gifts from the crown. She had seen both her siblings die. and had learned that royal favor was fleeting and dangerous. Jane Seymour and the Sun. Jane Seymour was Anne's opposite in nearly every way. Where Anne was dark, sophisticated, sharp-tongued, and reform-minded, Jane was pale, quiet, meek, and conventionally pious. She had served as one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, so she had witnessed firsthand the dangers of queenship. Jane's motto, chosen when she became queen, was bound to obey and serve. It signaled her approach. She would be submissive, traditional, unthreatening. She would not involve herself in politics or religion. She would not make enemies. She would simply be a wife and, hopefully, mother to the king's longed-for son. In early 1537, Jane became pregnant. The pregnancy progressed without incident through the spring and summer. On the 12th of October 1537, after a long and difficult labor lasting 2 days and 3 nights, Jane gave birth to a son. He was named Edward, after Henry's great ancestor Edward III. The relief and joy at court were overwhelming. England had its male heir at last. The succession was secured. Bells rang throughout London. Bonfires were lit. Te Deums were sung in churches. Henry wept with happiness. Everything he had done, the break with Rome, the execution of Catherine's supporters, the destruction of Anne Boleyn, all of it was vindicated by this one small boy. But the celebration was brief. Jane developed childbed fever, what we would now recognize as puerperal infection. Despite the efforts of physicians, she weakened rapidly. On the 24th of October 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to Edward, Jane Seymour died. Henry was genuinely grief-stricken. He had Jane buried at Windsor Castle with full royal honors, and when he died 10 years later, he would be buried beside her. Of all his wives, Henry seemed to regard Jane most fondly, perhaps because she had given him what he wanted most, perhaps because she died before the relationship could sour. But even in grief, the fact remained. Henry had his son. The Tudor succession was assured. Part 24. The Vindication of Reform. Although Anne Boleyn died disgraced, executed as an adulteress and traitor, her influence outlived her. The religious reform she had championed continued and even accelerated. In 1538, Henry ordered that every parish church in England should have a Bible in English available for all to read. This had been Anne's dream scripture, accessible to common people in their own language. The Great Bible, as it came to be called, was placed in churches throughout the realm. People who had never been able to read God's Word for themselves could now gather around and hear it read in English, could understand the stories and teachings without needing a priest to interpret Latin for them. The dissolution of the monasteries continued through the late 1532s, until by 1540, every monastic house in England had been closed. The monks and nuns were pensioned off or turned out. The great abbeys, Glastonbury, Fountains, Revals, were demolished or left to decay. Their lands were sold or granted to nobles and gentry. Their treasures were seized for the crown. It was a transformation of English life and landscape so complete that even today, 500 years later, the ruins of these monasteries dot the countryside as reminders of what was lost. The reformers Anne had protected and promoted rose to prominence. Thomas Cranmer remained Archbishop of Canterbury, carefully navigating Henry's religious conservatism while advancing reform where possible. Hugh Latimer, whom Anne had patronized, became Bishop of Worcester. Nicholas Shaxton, another of her protégés, became Bishop of Salisbury. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his son Edward VI was only 9 years old. During Edward's reign, with power exercised by a regency council dominated by reform-minded nobles, the English Reformation accelerated dramatically. The Book of Common Prayer, written primarily by Cranmer, replaced the Latin Mass with English liturgy. Images were removed from churches. Altars were replaced with communion tables. Clergy were allowed to marry. England became Protestant in doctrine as well as in governance. These changes would be reversed briefly when Edward died young and Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, took the throne in 1553. Mary was determined to restore Catholicism, and she persecuted Protestants with such ferocity that she earned the name Bloody Mary. Cranmer, Latimer, and hundreds of others were burned at the stake for heresy. But Mary's reign lasted only 5 years. When she died childless in 1558, the throne passed to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was 25 years old when she became queen. She had survived an extraordinarily dangerous childhood and adolescence. Declared illegitimate at age 3, largely ignored during her father's lifetime, suspected of treason during her sister Mary's reign, Elizabeth had learned to be cautious, clever, and ruthless when necessary. She was her mother's daughter, in appearance dark-eyed, dark-haired, with the same long face and sharp intelligence. She was also her mother's daughter in conviction, committed to the Protestant settlement, though moderate in its application, understanding that religion was as much about politics as about faith. Elizabeth re-established the Church of England as separate from Rome. She became supreme governor of the Church, a slightly softer title than her father's supreme head, but with the same meaning. The Book of Common Prayer was restored. England was officially Protestant, though Elizabeth tried to create a broad church that Catholics and Protestants could both accept, avoiding the extremes of either side. Elizabeth never married, despite enormous pressure to do so, and despite dozens of suitors over the decades. When asked why, she gave various reasons she was married to England. No foreign prince was suitable. No English noble could be raised so high without causing jealousy. But some historians have wondered if she also remembered her mother's fate, the danger of being a queen with a husband, the vulnerability of pregnancy and childbirth, the risks of trusting a man with power. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years, from 1558 to 1603. Her reign saw England transformed from a minor kingdom into a major power. The Spanish Armada was defeated in 1588. English ships explored the world. Shakespeare wrote his plays. The English Renaissance flourished. By the time Elizabeth died, England was confident, prosperous, and Protestant. And always, throughout her reign, Elizabeth was aware of her mother's shadow. She kept a ring that contained a miniature portrait of Anne Boleyn, hidden inside, close to her heart. She promoted men whose fathers had supported Anne. She never spoke openly of her mother. It was too politically dangerous, but she never forgot her either. The rehabilitation of Anne's memory. For a generation after her death, Anne Boleyn's reputation remained dark. She was the concubine, the woman who had bewitched the king, whose ambition had led to her destruction. Catholics saw her as the architect of England's heresy. Even many Protestants were uncomfortable celebrating a woman executed for adultery. But as Elizabeth's reign progressed and proved successful, views began to shift. If Elizabeth was a great queen, and by the 1582nd and 1592nd, most English people believed she was, then perhaps her mother had been misjudged. Perhaps Anne had been a martyr for the Protestant faith, destroyed by Catholic conspirators. Perhaps she had been innocent all along. Protestant writers began to rehabilitate Anne's image. John Foxe, in his famous Acts and Monuments known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, presented Anne as a virtuous reformer who had protected Protestants and promoted the gospel. He didn't mention the adultery charges or treated them as obvious fabrications. In Foxe's telling, Anne died not as a traitor, but as a proto-Protestant saint, persecuted by the forces of Catholic darkness. This version of Anne's story became influential, shaping Protestant memory for generations. To be Protestant in Elizabethan England increasingly meant to honor Anne Boleyn's memory, to see her as a foundational figure in England's break from Rome. Catholics, naturally, had a different view. Catholic writers portrayed Anne as an adulteress and schismatic, a woman whose ambition had led England into heresy and whose punishment proved God's judgment against her. The truth, as always, was more complex than either side acknowledged. Anne was neither saint nor monster, but a human being ambitious, intelligent, religiously committed, politically astute, and ultimately vulnerable to forces beyond her control. The historical questions. Even today, nearly 500 years after her death, historians debate key questions about Anne Boleyn's life. Was she guilty of the charges against her? Almost certainly not. The evidence was weak even by Tudor standards, much of it based on normal court interactions twisted into something sinister. Smeaton's confession was clearly coerced. The other accused men maintained their innocence. The timeline of the alleged affairs was impossible. Anne was often in different locations than the men she supposedly met for trysts. Most modern historians conclude the charges were fabricated to give Henry legal grounds to execute Anne. Why did Henry destroy her? The simplest answer is that he wanted to remarry and believed Anne could not give him more sons. The miscarriage of January 1536 convinced him that God was displeased with their marriage. Jane Seymour was already waiting in the wings, and Henry had convinced himself she would give him the sons Anne could not. But there may also have been political reasons. Anne's reform advocacy made her enemies among conservative nobles, and her abrasive personality had alienated potential supporters. She had not built a strong enough power base to protect herself when Henry's affection cooled. Did Anne commit any of the acts she was accused of? The evidence suggests not. Even the relationship with Henry Percy years before had been an honorable courtship, not a secret marriage that would have invalidated her later marriage to Henry. The incest charge with her brother was almost certainly fabricated. It was too monstrous to be anything but a way to ensure Anne's complete destruction. The adultery charges similarly appear to be inventions, based on misinterpreted courtly banter and politeness. What was Anne's relationship with the religious Reformation? This remains debated. Anne clearly supported reform she owned and read reformist books, protected reform preachers, advocated for English scripture. But was she Protestant? Protestantism as a distinct movement barely existed in England during most of Anne's queenship. She was almost certainly not Lutheran in theology. There's no evidence she accepted Luther's teachings on salvation by faith alone or rejected Catholic sacramental theology. She was more likely an evangelical Catholic, someone who wanted reform within the church, but not necessarily a complete break with Catholic doctrine. Her daughter Elizabeth's via media, the middle way between Protestantism and Catholicism, may have reflected Anne's own religious position. Anne, in historical memory. Over the centuries since her death, Anne Boleyn has been continually reinterpreted by each generation. In the Victorian era, she was often portrayed as a scarlet woman, a seductress who led the king astray. Victorian novels and histories emphasized her sexuality, her supposed French sophistication, her dark eyes and dark hair qualities the Victorians found both fascinating and threatening. In the 20th century, feminist historians began to reassess Anne, seeing her as a victim of patriarchal power, a woman destroyed by a system that valued her only for her ability to produce male heirs. In the 20th century, feminist historians began to reassess Anne, seeing her as a victim of patriarchal power, a woman destroyed by a system that valued her only for her ability to produce male heirs. In this reading, Anne was intelligent and capable, but she operated in a world where women's power was always derivative, always dependent on men's favor, always vulnerable. Her execution demonstrated the ultimate powerlessness of even a queen. If she could not give the king what he wanted, she could be discarded, and her very life was forfeit. Later 20th century scholars complicated this picture further, exploring Anne as a political actor in her own right, not merely a victim. They examined her patronage networks, her religious convictions, her influence on policy. This Anne was not passive, but active, making choices, forming alliances, pursuing her own agenda. Her tragedy was not that she was powerless, but that her power was ultimately insufficient to protect her when circumstances turned against her. Popular culture embraced Anne with particular enthusiasm. She appeared in countless novels, films, and television series, each generation reimagining her according to contemporary concerns. The 1969 film Anne of the Thousand Days portrayed her as a romantic heroine doomed by love. Philippa Gregory's novel The Other Boleyn Girl and its film adaptation presented her as ambitious and calculating, willing to use any means to become queen. The television series The Tudors showed her as passionate and reform-minded, caught between her principles and her survival. These popular portrayals often say more about the times in which they were created than about the historical Anne, but they testify to her enduring fascination. Of all Henry VIII's 6 wives, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, Anne remains the most famous, the most controversial, the most endlessly reinterpreted. The last words. As darkness falls and this long tale draws to a close, we return to that May morning in 1536, to Tower Green, to a woman kneeling in the straw, waiting for the sword. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul. These were Anne Boleyn's last words, repeated over and over in the final moments of her life. They were words of faith, of hope that whatever came after death would be better than what had come before. They were words that connected her to countless others who had died before her and would die after her, all hoping that death was not the end but a passage to something better. The executioner's sword fell, and Anne Boleyn passed from life into history. Her body was placed in an arrow chest and buried without ceremony. Her name was stricken from prayers and proclamations. Her enemies celebrated her fall. Her few remaining friends stayed silent, knowing that any defense of her would be dangerous. But history had not finished with Anne Boleyn. Her daughter would grow up to become queen. The religious reforms she championed would prevail. Her story would be told and retold, debated and reinterpreted, reimagined by generation after generation. The woman they tried to erase from memory became one of history's most memorable figures. 500 years have passed since Anne Boleyn was born into an ambitious family in the early Tudor court. Nearly 500 years have passed since she walked to the scaffold on Tower Green and lost her head to the executioner's sword. Yet still we tell her story. Still we wonder about her life. Still we try to understand the woman behind the legend. She was Anne Boleyn, daughter, sister, courtier, reformer, queen, prisoner, condemned traitor, mother of Elizabeth I, and ultimately, one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in English history. Her life was extraordinary, her death was tragic, and her legacy endures. Through all the centuries since she died, through all the changes in England and the world, her story continues to captivate, to trouble, and to inspire. And so we leave her, resting beneath the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula, beside her brother George, beneath the altar where prayers are still said, in the shadow of the White Tower where English history has unfolded across 1,000 years. Her story is told, her life examined, her place in history secured. The woman who briefly wore England's crown sleeps on, while the world she helped shape continues to remember her name. The end. And that's the end of Anne Boleyn's story. Thanks for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this calm history session, feel free to subscribe, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next video.